I'm Bob Blaskiewicz. I'm a critical thinking teacher from Stockton University. I teach mostly first-year students, do a couple of classes on science and pseudoscience. Conspiracy theories is that's my bag, but increasingly over the last couple of years I've been taking more and more of an interest in medical scams, medical fraud, and that sort of thing. Which has led to the Facebook group, the Skeptics for the Protection of Cancer Patients. I'm also on Virtual Skeptics, which is a show on Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock Eastern, live on YouTube, and then Skepticality, which is a very cool podcast that's been around forever. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about what the world looked like before we had vaccines to treat the common infectious diseases of childhood with a couple of side glances to other diseases. In particular, I'll be looking at folk beliefs and practices related to childhood diseases from the era where we had very few efficacious treatment options, more than looking after the kid and make sure they didn't die over the course of the night. Kind of wait out these diseases and hope for the best. Most of the superstitions and practices that in the first half of the talk will come from the 19th century, and then I'll turn to dubious treatments in the 20th century when we enter the age of some more advanced therapeutics. You'll see that the folk wisdom sort of morphs somewhat, not necessarily a trust of scientific methods of treatment so much as something else that has no small amount of magical thinking associated with it. So at the end of the 19th century, we see a good deal of interest in collecting and preserving the folk histories and beliefs of numerous nations. In Ireland, the collection of these stories coincided with the Celtic cultural revival, and the whole phenomenon, I think, kind of draws influence from the rise of German philology much earlier, and close criticism, which uncovered processes of creation and production of historical folk narratives. So we have a pretty well studied, pretty systematically organized body of beliefs from the 19th century in English-speaking countries. The dates I'll be giving you guys are approximate. Sometimes the source is in a printed interview with someone remembering their childhood for the most part. The superstition was alive within the lifetime of the person who's reporting this to the investigators. I should point out that with a single exception, the metaphorical interpretations that I give you of these are mine, but I think they seem pretty reasonable. I think you'll buy it. Okay, so all right. So unless I mention otherwise, assume that the superstitions I mention come from Opie and Tatum's collection, their dictionary of superstitions. I was also able to find good sources on superstitions in Pennsylvania and in County Cork. So those are the ones. We're a little bit all over the place here. When you read about these superstitions, they tell you a lot about the regions where they come from. So in a fishing community, if you see a bowl that's flipped over, you might not go on your boat that day, Or if you're in a mining town and in the morning your shoes have tipped over, maybe you don't go in the hole that day. Superstitions reflect the fears, the hopes, and values of the people who harbor them. Most of the superstitions in the Oxford Dictionary reflect the concerns of rural, largely agricultural communities, and they're preoccupied with things like warding off droughts, making sure that your beehives are healthy, and apparently you do that by giving them updates on how the head of household is doing, and that just keeps them so they know where their loyalties lie, right? So, as one does. So cures for what are now vaccine-preventable childhood diseases could be quite unpleasant. People are willing to suffer through these treatments or permit their children to suffer them, I think reflects the seriousness of the diseases something that we don't really have much of a sense of anymore because we don't see them as often as we used to. Diphtheria is pretty unpleasant and dangerous enough that in 19th century Fayetteville, near Pittsburgh, parents would be willing to place what's called a, quote, poultice consisting of the fresh excrement of a hog about the neck of their child for one night for diphtheria. Hoffman relates that, quote, cow dung poultices were also known to have been used for this disease, but more faith is placed in a band of red flannel secured around the neck. There's great faith in the color of the material used. The general impression prevailing is that all red flannel is medicated, and there appears to be an association between the ideas, between the color of the flannel and that of the inflamed throat. So what we're looking at is kind of a sympathetic magic between the treatment and the disease. Somehow it reflects the conditions of the disease. This is going to be a recurring theme. So, for instance, putting a child with rickets on an anvil. Not a vaccine-preventable disease, but you put the kid on the anvil and you give him 3 taps with a hammer, right? That's supposed to strengthen his spongy bones. Another one, to cure the mumps, you might take the swollen parts of the neck of a child and rub them against the same part of a hog, trying to push them off onto the farm animal. I don't think that worked. But yeah, now not all of the treatments were as awful as a cow chip facial. You should have seen the revision process so I could come up with something appropriate to describe that. In 1911, the journal Folklore noted that in Gloucestershire, that wheat crushed on an anvil was beneficial for shingles somehow. And an interesting topical treatment for shingles was the oil that was used to lubricate church bells, which apparently if you could sell that apparently and make some money. We see this remedy in England reported in 1882, but it's also found as recently as 1978. So I went through the literature relating to superstition. I found something I wasn't expecting, which is the fun part of doing research. It's a disease that spawns so many proposed cures, and that it must have been a matter of near obsessive concern. Whooping cough, pertussis. There are a number of themes in the British superstitions outlined in Opie and Tatum, and it's kind of hard to sort them. So I've tried to sort them kind of topically, but we will be going on both sides of the pond and maybe jumping forth and back and forth in time. One motif that sticks out and illustrates exactly how deadly people thought whooping cough was the theme of burial, which appears in a number of different places and in different times. So what you would do, the straightforward example of the practice recorded in the 1830s was to dip the person into a grave 9 times. They knew that this was serious stuff, and I suspect that what they're trying to do is fake out the disease, modified versions of this dipping practice. It might be an allusion to baptism or pseudo-burial. You might put a person face down in a very shallow grave and have them breathe into the bottom of the grave. In the 1810s, you might seek to propitiate the aerial beings by taking a child into a cave, another sort of burial, and chanting "Hob, hole, hob." I'm not doing the accent. "Hob, hole, hob, my bairn's got the kink cough, take it off, take it off." Opie and Tatum found a machine-age variation on this theme, hanging the head of a child out of a window on a train going through a tunnel. Because if fresh coal smoke doesn't cure an irritated respiratory system, I don't know what will, right? Well, no, there is that too, well, you won't have a cough anymore, or a head, but yeah, so, and it turns out that deliberately irritating the lungs of children with whooping cough was really, it's a whole class of cures related to that. One that sticks out is that you'd suspend the child over the hopper in a grain mill. And so the dust that was kicked up was toxic. Yeah, I know. You wonder why people had a long-standing distrust of like doctors and stuff way back in the day. It's because this is the type of stuff you ended up doing. No. As late as the 20th century, people were called patients being taken to a grain mill during an epidemic of whooping cough. And the miller starting up the mill and saying, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, grind away this disease." You might have to repeat this several times for optimal results. This apparently comes from a tradition that goes back to at least, and probably much farther back, to the mid-18th century. An English physician, Robert James, recounted how some rustics would try to scare the whooping cough right out of the kid. And I read from his dictionary, quote, "Another empirical method of curing the kink cough," which is whooping cough, "when medicines prove ineffectual, is to fright the child by putting it in the hopper of a mill, which makes a terrible noise. And the aspect of those wheels is dreadful. And by this method, a kink cough is sometimes suddenly cured. The reason of which consists in this, not only that the animal spirits being by the fright forced into new distractions, leave their former inordinate motions, but also that the matter producing the spasms is by such perturbation either dissipated or forced into other nerves where it becomes less troublesome," which is, I think, the 18th century equivalent of restoring your quantum frequencies to balance. I'm not, yeah. So cures for whooping cough often involved a surprising amount of cruelty to very small animals. For instance, we're going into a long list of things here. All right, so one might hang something from the afflicted child's neck. So in the 1850s, you might take a caterpillar and put it in a little bag around a baby's neck. As the caterpillar died, so the cough, the thinking went, abated. Alternately, you might pass small snails through the hands of the afflicted and hang them on a string in the chimney, obviously. An earlier version involved wrapping a house spider in muslin above the mantle and letting it die. In 1889 Ireland, Pine reported something similar. Quote, "Catch a bluebottle fly, put it in a corked bottle, and as the fly gets weaker and dies, so will the cough take its departure. Vouched for and seen by my informant," she said. Another version was to take a dead beetle, hang it around the neck of a child with whooping cough, and as the bug rotted away, the cough vanished too. You could also put items usually associated with squeezing around the neck of a child. Again, a sort of sympathetic magical cure related to the strangling sensations that children would be feeling as they had the whooping cough. You might use the corset lace of the child's godmother that had 9 knots put in it, or the garter of the child's godfather. In the 1890s, you could take 9 hairs, again, the number 9 keeps coming up, off the back of a donkey and put them in a bag around the neck of the sick kid. And something you should notice is that you have this stripe and another stripe running roughly perpendicular to it. And so there's like this cross on the donkey's back, and that becomes important because this is not the only donkey cure we're going to see. There's so many of them. One that is told about by a guy from the CDC, and he gave me a picture of it. Was passing a child underneath the legs of a donkey. Maybe this is a type of rebirth or something, I'm not sure. This was recorded in the 1820s and remembered as late as the 1930s. The cures could get pretty elaborate with a donkey and whooping cough. So here's one from Ireland. Get a mare, donkey, and milk, and have a person standing on each side of the animal. One passes the child under the body of the donkey to the other, who returns it over the back. Do this 9 times for 3 mornings fasting. This was tried with a female donkey of CLs on 2 of her laborers' children who are a grown man and woman now, and the donkey is alive and kicking. This is like the only happy ending you're going to get in this entire... No. So, yeah. This also seems to be related to a couple of other practices. For instance, passing the baby underneath a piebald horse. In the 1680s, whooping cough might be treated by passing the child through a bramble arch, so like a blackberry bush that kind of has grown over into an arch shape. And we see something similar in 1831, only you pass the child through the bramble arch 3 times before breakfast. Apparently, whooping cough became increasingly resistant to this treatment. And in the 1870s, we see that you have to go through a much more elaborate ritual to get rid of it. Pass the child under and over the arch 9 times for 3 mornings before sunrise, repeating, under the briar and over the briar, I wish to leave the kink cough here. Then you had to cut the briar, twist it into a cross, and wear it on your breast, or on the child's breast. In a case of a cough that did not respond well to blackberry bushes, you might resort to an Irish cure reported by Speranza Wilde, who's the mother of Oscar. Take 9 hairs from the tail of a black cat, chopped up and soaked in water, which is then swallowed, and the cough will be relieved. Nonetheless, donkeys were the broad-spectrum antibiotics of childhood diseases. I know, because it's adorbs. In 1908, in Northern Ireland, the donkey treatment was seen as a prophylactic against measles. Wilson noted that in, quote, some parts of Ireland, when one has been attacked with scarlet fever, some of the sick person's hair is cut off and passed down the throat of a donkey, which is supposed to receive the disease at once. In 1885, the journal Notes and Queries reported that, quote, in Kent and Essex, measles will be cured by giving to the sufferer some hair from the node where the stripes of an ass cross sprinkled on bread and butter. So there's that cross on the back of the donkey. Donkeys, however, could also cause disease if you were not careful. As the magazine The Maidstone Gazette reported in 1848, so strong a hold has the genius of superstition among the peasantry of South Wales, it's dripping with like superiority there, that a woman recently bitten by a mad donkey was sent to the churchyard of St. Edrins to eat the grass, which it is believed has the peculiar property of being an antidote to hydrophobia, to rabies. According to Lewis's 1833 Topographical Dictionary of Wales, the grass in St. Edrins churchyard is asserted by many residents in the vicinity to be specific for preserving both men and cattle from the effects of the bite of a mad dog. By the former it is eaten with bread and butter, and the latter are turned in to graze upon it. And in those which in that condition have eaten it, no symptoms of madness have afterwards appeared, while on the contrary, such as would not have uniformly died in a short time. And there's a hole in the wall of the chancery where you can drop money to be, in order to pay for your salvation there. It's before insurance companies. So, as I mentioned, if you don't have a donkey or your donkey has rabies and is therefore unavailable, you should pass the child with pertussis under the belly of a piebald horse, whose breath was also thought to be curative. There's the image of the piebald horse I wanted to show. They were they appeared in one of these county court cures. So this is the account by Pine. Quote, if you see a man riding by on a white or piebald horse, anything he tells you to do will effect a cure. You say, wish a man on the white or piebald horse. For God's sake, do you know any cure for the kink cough? He, faith then, I don't know of any cure, unless to take the child fasten to the 4 crossroads and give him his feeding there for 4 mornings running, so 4 mornings in a row. Because if you can't trust a guy on a piebald horse, who can you trust, really, right? Yeah. So in the 1850s, you might consider putting a trout's head into the mouth of the sufferer and letting the trout breathe into the child's mouth. Yeah, not a dead one.
Whole trout, but just the head. Okay.
You could try the whole trout, but nobody's going to be happy about it. So this one probably has another symbolic association with asphyxiation. You know, the fish out of water, it's not breathing. You're kind of choking the kid with a trout. Like, I know, I'm just trying to figure out, like, that would be such child abuse right now, you know, like assault with a loaded fish. Or so, you know, like, yeah. They were, in Pennsylvania, though, one of the regional cures was to thrust a live fish into the throat. So this one, ironically, the fish had legs. Thank you, yeah. Trout were an important curative, it seems, for whooping cough. An interesting one, remembered in the 1930s, suggested that drinking milk a trout had been made to swim in would be beneficial. You could also drown a fish in beer, which you then drank. Other lactose-based treatments for the king cough included drinking new milk from a bowl made of holly, a wooden bowl made of holly, though ivy wood bowls would also work. And in the 1860s, for the whooping cough, let the patient drink some milk from which a ferret has lapped. This is actually exceedingly cruel because ferrets, and I checked, are lactose intolerant. So, I know, like, it's the damnedest thing, yeah. One treatment not dissimilar from putting a trout in your mouth was putting a live toad's head in your mouth, thereby transferring the sickness to the toad. You could also try a soup with 9 frogs in it, as was recorded in Yorkshire. But it was important that nobody saw the frogs as you carried them home and prepared the soup. And I'm willing to bet that includes especially the person you're going to give the soup to, right? Yeah. An especially innovative cure involved feeding children, oh, this is a good one, feeding children either roasted or fried mice. You could also take the mouse, do this to it, then powder it, and put it in the patient's morning and evening beverage. So as Barb Drescher once pointed out to me, if you add water to powdered mice, you just get mice, right? So Pliny, by the way, thought that serving a boiled mouse to a child cured bedwetting. So they're pretty useful. This is why, I guess that's why they're used in research so much. So yeah, there are actually comparatively few overtly religious and specifically religious superstitions. And a practice that went back to the 1770s. People afflicted with whooping cough could go to Catholic churches to drink out of the chalice after Mass. It's probably a good idea. Well, and, you know, you see like these Roman physicians telling people with these horrible skin diseases, go to the baths, the public baths. That'll be good for you. Yeah, so I have the same kind of feeling about that, yeah. So, of course, if you don't like going to church, and, you know, there may be people here, you can always fast on a Sunday and carry the sick child just to 3 parishes. That'll do the same thing. A kid with whooping cough was, of course, a miserable creature. So how can you make it more miserable? Well, how about you take the child down to the ocean at low tide and make it drink seawater? When he vomited, poor kid, coughing and vomiting, it's just not a good combo. The sickness was thought to disperse with the sick. Okay, yeah. So, yeah. So sometimes criminal acts could help a child with pertussis. Not in Andrew Wakefield's case, but whatever. So in Pennsylvania, one treatment for whooping cough, according to Hoffman, was to, quote, administer milk stolen from a neighbor's cow. In Ireland, Pine found stores of weirder therapeutic thefts. The gossip, that is, the godfather of the child, without being told by any one of the child's people, but by his own vile inspiration, must steal, that is, cut off, the ear of his neighbor's living goat close to the head, make a hole in it with a fork, and pass a string through it. This is tied to the child's neck and is meant to be sucked by the child. This was tried on Han Twomey, Mary L's factotum, that's jack of all trades, about 30 years ago. She told me about it, and her cousin, wife of our plowman, remembers well seeing this loathsome object round the child's neck for about 3 months. So clearly it was working. Truly, the native Irish are savages. It's like, so, yep. In 1908, Wilson noted that in Devonshire and Scotland, one might feed the hair of a baby with whooping cough to a dog. We saw that there was a donkey cure that was like that. This is reminiscent of a rabies treatment from the late 19th century, which, according to Hoffman, the belief noted by Mr. Phillips, as current in the vicinity of Philadelphia, obtains in various localities in the Blue Mountains, quote, to cure a bite, use a hair of the dog that caused it. It is sometimes placed between 2 slices of buttered bread and eaten as a sandwich. Apparently, the idea of the hair of the dog that bit you as a cure is quite old. The earliest reference I could find to it, and Eve helped me do this, was a reference to it as drinking away a hangover in 1546. This is reputed to be derived from an older rabies cure, but we couldn't find a source for that. The earliest reference I found to it as a literal treatment, the hair of the dog that bit you, comes from the 18th century. So, now a few whooping cough cures that I don't know how you're supposed to categorize them. You could serve a sick kid porridge, but only if you prepared it over a stream flowing from east to west. Finally, you could give the afflicted a piece of bread made by a woman who has successively married 2 men, both of whom shared the same last name. I said you can't categorize it. So in the last decades of the 19th century, medicine was taking a more recognizably modern form. This is what I'm calling a transition. Prior to that period, it was often difficult to distinguish medicine, legitimate medicine from pseudo-medicine. Neither was regulated, and patent medicines could be loaded with powerful narcotics that really felt like they were doing something. And to be fair, what doctors could do was often unpleasant and of little to no value. These limitations were recognized and expressed by painter John Constable in a letter from 1827 about his newborn son who had whooping cough. Quote, I find medical men know little of this terrible disorder and can afford it no relief. Consequently, it is in the hands of quacks. By the end of the 19th century, germ theory was established, biochemistry was becoming more advanced, the tools and techniques of testing had improved, and new drugs were coming online. Standards were being set up for the licensure and regulation of physicians in this country. The AMA, ta-da, very nice, very nice, began sorting legitimate medicines from illegitimate medicines by establishing labeling standards that you needed in order to have an ad for your drug published in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And that went to all of the association's members, and that was most of the physicians. In 1906, Arthur J. Cramp, who became a physician after his daughter died in the hands of a quack, began writing about quackery for Hygeia, the magazine that was put out for the public by the AMA, so it's a more popular read. A few years later, Cramp was selected to head what would become known as the AMA's Bureau of Investigation. What was started there went a long way to establish the AMA as a medical authority and clearinghouse for reliable information about new and questionable treatments, and in doing so established what was legitimate medicine, basically by defining what was illegitimate. I just returned a week ago, Sunday. I came back from a trip to the Bureau of Investigation's archive. It was an exploratory trip. I thought, maybe I'll find something interesting that relates to the talk I'm giving at the end of the week, and maybe show something that people haven't seen for decades. So, and the medical fraud archive is it's like the Willy Wonka factory for skeptics. It's just this wondrous place of these amazing, the quackery of yesteryear. It's amazing. Cramp and his successors gathered the most remarkable collection of primary and secondary materials related to 20th century quackery. What's most remarkable to me, at least, is how it was compiled. Physicians around the nation sent in news clippings, patient queries, professional queries, advertisements, and all sorts of other relevant materials. And the AMA kept it all. Essentially, the medical community was an extended surveillance network for the AMA. And the finding guide, which lists just the folders, is like 300 pages long. I spent 5 days there. Nothing. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. So what I found in the collection was a sort of continuity between the superstitions of old and some of these fake new treatments. The companies that sold these patent medicines made use of the same hopes and capitalized on the same fears, uncertainty, and insecurity that have always plagued the sick. Whereas older superstitions reflected the material world they were practiced in, the new quack cures impersonated the language of the new and emerging medicine and the treatments of actual medicine. So as I mentioned, the childhood disease with the strongest presence in the literature of superstition in the 19th century was whooping cough. In the 20th century, a number of nostrums were marketed as cures for that disease. There was no vaccination for pertussis until the 1930s. A product called Jaeger's Huco was marketed to mothers as a remedy for whooping cough. The Buffalo, New Jersey outfit that made the stuff, the Coral Chemical Company, recommended that you take Huco and spray it in your child's nose and throat in the morning and at night. And if you took it with their Coral Specific, another product of theirs, for external use only, it would treat bronchitis, asthma, and tonsillitis. Testing done on Huco by the AMA, they had a chemical lab that actually was... The government consulted with that lab because they didn't have their own resources yet. The FDA hadn't been established. They did testing on it, and they showed that it consisted of borax and another antiseptic, and was basically worthless at stopping whooping cough. Another treatment I found was something that was called Beldrogelsin, which combined belladonna, which is potentially really poisonous if you get the wrong part of the plant, and this one, Drosera rotundifolia, which is a carnivorous plant. If you were a fly right now, you'd be terrified. Drosera had a long reputation of being a cough cure, but I've seen nothing convincing to suggest that it is. And it's still being used to treat whooping cough, kind of. I found it in a variety of a number of homeopathic remedies. So apparently giving someone Drosera works just as well as not giving someone Drosera. That kind of tells you what you need to know, right? So yeah. The disease that gets the most attention in the 20th century, I think, in the files that I looked at, was polio. Before April of 1955, when Jonas Salk, when his vaccine was approved, 10,000 cases, or tens of thousands of cases of polio were diagnosed every year. And there was an explosion in the rate of polio in the US from the annual average of 20,000 to 58,000 in 1952. And there was understandably panic about the growth of polio. By contrast, in 1961, 6 years after the vaccine was released, there were only 161 cases. So before this, people were looking for cures everywhere. For instance, boom. Yeah. This article has the firm warning, quote, ill-considered use of cobra venom or its products can produce great harm. That's what we call litotes, dramatic understatement. So this area of research was advocated for decades afterwards by a herpetologist in Florida who promoted it for a long time. I've never seen evidence that it was work. I mean, it's certainly a biologically active substance, but I don't know. Yeah. But if you do hear otherwise, I'd be pleased to know. In May 1958, as the rate of polio was crashing down, Dr. Marion T. Davidson, who is an allergist, that's his obituary. Moment of silence. All right, let's go. All right. An allergist in Alabama sent a letter to the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis and attached a manuscript, which he also forwarded to the president of the AMA, who was kind of the face of American medicine, this guy named Morris Fishbein. And he forwarded it to the quackery department. In this short paper, Davidson argues that poliomyelitis is a misdiagnosis. Polio is actually botulism. In his letter, he introduces himself in this way, quote, I wish to apply for recognition by the Foundation for having shown by my article, a copy of which is attached, called Anterior Poliomyelitis or Botulism, the correct diagnoses, causes, methods of prevention, and possible treatments for the group of paralytic diseases wrongly diagnosed as anterior poliomyelitis. I wish also to apply for immediate payment of my charge of $15 million to be paid to me through the Trust Department of the First National Bank of Birmingham, Alabama. Jonas Salk, who famously did not take a patent out on the polio vaccine, Davidson was apparently not. So yeah, now the idea, and he did think that botulism was being introduced into milk, and then the toxin survived pasteurization. That was his thing. The idea that milk might be a source of infection might not have been completely bonkers. In December of 25, 8 cases of polio were traced back to a dairy farm in New York, where a 16-year-old had continued working after he fell ill. And then in 1952, 6 children in one family fell ill when the eldest, before going to milk the cows, had contracted it from a friend, and the whole family drank the milk, and and it wasn't pasteurized, and so yeah. And when you think about it, there's probably a correlation with milk consumption of children and polio. So you might see something there. Maybe it's not surprising that Davidson wasn't the only person to suspect that milk might be at the root of polio. More accusations against milk came from a man named Horace V. Jonah, who was a physician in Maine. In October of 52, he sent a 5-page letter to the AMA where he outlined his theory. In this letter, he assured the AMA that he had ruled out all possibilities such as government corruption and foreign government agents. It was the Red Scare, after all. Quote, the infected individual in every case, without exception, is a milk consumer. I have therefore come to the conclusion that milk is the sole origin of the 3 types of polio or infantile virus. In particular, he was worried that store-bought milk and the hygienic conditions on dairy farms that supplied it. He thought that those were not, he cited specific concerns about sanitation. First among his recommendations to eliminate polio, restore daily milk delivery. And another one was to remind the dairyman of his obligation to society. Okay, seems good. No, he was, well, he signed his letter, Horace V. Jonah, Bioresearch. He was, yeah, so he was, he was the son of a physician, I believe. Yeah, so the AMA sent a brief, polite reply, Mr. Jonah, your recent communication on preventative polio is being referred to other offices which are interested in the subject. And if it had just, they'd left it there, Jonah would have just been a well-meaning but wrong person, but apparently he started haranguing dairy farmers in his home state of Maine. He told them that he had studied 3,500 cases of polio, and they had all been users of pasteurized milk. They actually gathered a group of people together to discuss it, brought him in with their lawyer and trade representatives, and they found out that, in fact, he didn't actually inspect the places he was accusing of being unsanitary. He looked at them from the outside, and they decided, maybe it's best just to walk away. But my favorite example of milk polio quackery comes from Chicago on November 2nd, 1949. The Marquette University School of Medicine sent an inquiry to the AMA Bureau of Investigation asking about something called J. Rowe Laboratories. In the letter, the dean of the school reported that they'd received a number of inquiries about someone named James Rowe, who'd been handing out cards that mentioned one of their faculty members, and which read, Dr. Eben J. Carey, Dean of Medicine at Marquette University, said after listening to this lecture and questioning Mr. Rowe for over 5 hours, quote, you have discovered the true case of poliomyelitis. You have answered every question that has come up in my 25 years of research on polio, which I could not solve. You have made an astounding discovery. Marquette was concerned that this Rowe fellow, whoever he was, it turns out, a city parks construction supervisor, might be misrepresenting the late Dr. Carey and what he was saying about him. He was dead. All right, so the Bureau of Investigation had a description on file, and reported that he'd reportedly was preparing a treatise which would be published in early 46. Soon a letter came in from R.J. Siebold, who was a colleague of Rose, also an air conditioner mechanic. The letter had been written on November 14th and informed the recipient, apparently someone he had seen in a newspaper, that Mr. Rowe had cured polio and could prevent it. He'd known about this cure for years and was only now setting up shop in Chicago in a simple office with a lecture room and treatment rooms. And somebody tipped off the Chicago Tribune that this was going on. So about 2 months later, on February 8th, a reporter by the name of Norma Lee Browning reported that she'd been to the J. Rowe laboratories, and in her words, quote, "This Tribune reporter thought she had seen everything until her visit to 7705 Ashland Avenue." That says 7707. Pay no attention to that. Yeah. It's actually like a furniture store or something now. So Browning attended one of his lectures where there was a family of 4 in attendance. The 2 boys were both crippled by polio. One was on crutches, one was in a wheelchair. Rowe told them this story about a fictional boy named Johnny who drank a quart of milk, went swimming, and then contracted polio. Rowe claimed that it was the milk. Even though public swimming pools were thought to be breeding grounds of disease, they may not have actually been, but there was the perception, especially with Roosevelt, who contracted after swimming. But yeah. The mother in the audience panic, and I quote Browning's story, quote, "In my research," Rose said pompously, "I have found that every polio victim has been a hearty milk drinker. For the 2 milk drinkers present, the construction man prescribed 1 glass of water to each glass of milk. This might counteract the ill effects," he said. He followed this up with an appeal for money to help him get his cure out to the mothers and fathers of America and to tell their friends about his treatment, Rosage. He worked with napropaths who, according to Martin Gardner, were a Chicago-born offshoot of chiropractors, and a doctor whose license had been revoked to give out prescriptions to these patients. The reporter received a prophylactic Rosage a week later from Seabelt, the air conditioner guy, who told her to disrobe and put on a gown, and started to pound her shoulder, back, spine, legs, and arms with his fist and thumping her with his fingers. Then things got a little creepy. Now read from the article, quote, "Stop worrying," said the Rosager. "You're too tense. Relax. You know what I think? You're a mental case. What you need to do is relax and have fun." He leaned close, leering, and whispered, "There, there, little girl. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." "I'm not," this reporter replied, scared stiff. "You know, you remind me of my brother-in-law, only he's about twice as big as you. He's a cop, you know." The Rosage was immediately ended. Seabelt was arrested the week before the story came out for practicing medicine without a license. And on February 21st of 1950, James Rowe received a 30-day suspension from his job with the Parks Commission for holding down 2 jobs. Yeah, so that's my show and tell, people.